But yeah, I love fresh bread as well.
It's good.
I mean, rye bread's not fresh bread really, but I mean, no, it's yeah. That is I say when I go to the continent sometimes, that's one of the things I really like. The smell in the air of baked goods.
Yeah. It's good. It's good. And coffee, good coffee.
Yeah. I've bought new coffee from Marks and Spencer's, and it's where they have coffee kind of rankings. It goes like from 1 to like 6 or something in terms of strength.
Yeah.
The one I've got at the moment, it's like a 3, and it's really not doing the trick. It's too light. I need to go from a 4 or 5, I think.
Yeah, I find it very difficult to find good ground coffee here. So Sainsbury's that's the place I frequent because it's close by, right? It has these sort of home brand things which are decent, but none of them is really good. But I don't want to pay like six pounds for a half a pound of coffee. That's too much. That's excessive. So I have found, I think, the most like some sort of a working solution. So but it's not good. It's not strong, and if you make it strong, it's very acidic. Like it's basically like acid.
Are you an espresso or mug, or are you?
I'm back to drip coffee, as the Americans call it. But in Italy, of course, there was a lot of espresso because you will not find filter coffee there. It's impossible. But espresso is not very pleasant for my stomach. I have a fairly weak stomach in that sense. And it's very concentrated, and it also makes my head like I'm getting older, right? So when I was in my 20s, I could drink like buckets of coffee, and now a small cup in the morning, and that's it. And because otherwise my brain is completely overstimulated, and I'm completely I feel that my mind has sort of left my body and is kind of floating around in the cosmos. That's how I feel, which is not a pleasant feeling.
I had a seminar weeks ago, which I went to, where I'd already had a cup of coffee, and then because it's around 11 o'clock, I usually make myself another cup of coffee to take to the seminar. It's a 2-hour seminar, and I got in there, but about 15 minutes, 20 minutes before, I could really start to feel that I was starting to get a bit of a headache. And I got in there and I went through the first hour, I drank all my coffee, and I got to the break midway through, and I decided I've got some like Sudafed in my bag, Sudafed tablets, and they've got painkillers in, so I'll take those. The problem is they've also got caffeine in them as well. So the second half of the seminar, the painkillers hadn't kicked in, but the caffeine kicked in. So I'd had 2 cups of coffee, and then this concentrated caffeine in the Sudafed. So I still had the headache, but at the same time, I could just feel my heart just going boom, 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 boom. Like your body, you just feel a bit like and it was. I think I got through it okay. I think they still understood what we were doing, but I was just standing there at the front of the class, just slow, breathe, because I was like, my head pounding and my heart going. I was like, this is the worst combination. And this gives me a great segue. If you'd said to me a couple of years ago that we're going to talk about Roman law for a while, I'd have been like, oh, this is going to give me a headache. But I will say, talking to you since you arrived at Kent, I've really started to change my opinion on Roman law. I mean, I think when you say, because Roman law being your speciality, I guess when somebody says Roman law, you just think of literally like legal codes, and you just think of the law courts essentially in society. But as you say, that actually the laws give you a window into everyday life, a very unique window into everyday life, and you can actually see a lot of what goes on in people's lives in the Roman world via law. And since you said that to me, I've kind of been like, yeah, no, I really get it now. Yeah.
Yeah, so let me just clarify one thing from the start, and that is I don't look at law as a lawyer.
Yeah.
And I think that is kind of the trick to keep it interesting, because so I apologize to all the lawyers who may be listening to this.
I'm sure I have a large lawyer following.
Of course. They will try to get us all fired, right? Yeah, I mean, law is interesting. It can be very interesting, and I actually have an interest. I had an interest in that too. So when I started university, I was considering to go to the law department rather than the classics. We can talk about that at some point. And so there are, legal problems are interesting problems, but it becomes very technical and very dry. And also, once you start focusing on the doctrine, it becomes this kind of universe of its own. And law codes often have long lives and stuff like that. So, you get this kind of, you run the risk of looking at it from sort of very, very much from a systematic or sort of laboratory perspective. Whereas what I find interesting is the role of law in society, and how do Romans think about law and the importance of law, and how does law illuminate something about Roman life other than, they were such rational people, right? This is still in Roman legal studies a very sort of, I want to say 19th century kind of idea that they were so rational and they were so good and blah blah blah. Well, yes, they were smart people. There were some very bright minds there, but I'm not sure that I find that the most interesting thing about Roman law, and especially, the laws of the Republic and the jurists are very difficult sources because they are somewhat sort of timeless and fragmentary and stuff like that. But once you get to the later codes, in particular the Code of Justinian, these are imperial responses to people who petitioned about a specific case. So they had a problem with their neighbor, or they had a problem with someone in the town, or I don't know, there are cases of town councillors who were found out to be slaves from the next town, basically. What do we do with this, right? And many of those cases, so we usually only have the responses of the emperor or his secretarial staff, probably. But these, they usually summarize the case quite nicely. So you get this very specific idea of people's problems, sort of their attempts to seek help, and dates of these rescripts, as we call them. They go from basically from Hadrian until, or Severus probably, until Justinian-ish. And many of them cluster around the Tetrarchy, because Diocletian, some people say that he issued 2 law codes with rescripts, so those are important sources for the Code of Justinian, but it's more likely that they were sort of privately, in sort of scare quotes, produced, and that Diocletian was probably quite happy with that, for that to happen. So people had actually these kind of rescripts available. So in that sense, I'm interested. The Theodosian Code is a very complicated source as well, because they are laws of general application, general import, but they were probably also triggered by individual cases. So you have this kind of, it's a bit like the Code of Justinian, but it's not always as specific. And they're usually addressed not to individuals, but to officials in the bureaucracy. So they give an interesting view about imperial communication, about ruling the empire.
So is that kind of the question then, is that if they're answering somebody's petition, obviously these things got to get compiled in these big law codes, and they're seen as being laws that are enacted across the empire. But by and large, then, would they actually have tended to probably have been not really the case? So I suppose would there have been quite a lot of variability in whether or not something is actually then applied across the empire, or whether or not it's then just really applied to that case? Because obviously, in my case, the really interesting one is Book 16 of the Theodosian Code, all about religion, and particularly the so-called pagan beliefs in it. But I didn't even really realise that when I was doing the PhD, that what you were saying about the idea of, and I don't know how many other people realise that as well, because everyone bangs on about that book, and it's got all these laws about these anti-pagan legislation. But as you say, that they're probably actually issued because somebody's gone to the emperor and just whinged about a temple near their house or something.
There are cases, not many, but there are cases in which you can actually prove this. So there is I think there is this council of, one of the councils of Carthage. I always forget which one and how many there are and stuff, but that's not entirely my thing, the councils. But the bishops have this fight about orthodoxy, or branding someone as a heretic, and then there is some powerful faction or perhaps a majority. I really don't know the details at this point. I need to sort it out. And they said, okay, we have made this decision. Now we go to the emperor to try to petition him and ask him to condemn the other faction as heretics so that they can be punished. And they succeeded. And we know this either because it's in the Council Acts or we have a law that corresponds exactly to this in the Theodosian Code. It's one of the two. I'm very rusty about this now. But this is a quite interesting case. So here you can actually see, they sent someone over to Constantinople basically and got this sorted for themselves, right? It's quite interesting, yeah. About the Code of Justinian and the rescripts that are in there, many of which are Tetrarchic, the question is more problematic because, yes, they were issued for a case, but then you have other legal sources, like legal textbooks for education, and say, well, if a rescript has been issued once, you can use it as a precedent. So you can either use it in court or you can go and petition the emperor and he will probably grant you the same request if you can argue your case is similar. So this is, they had a certain authority. I don't like to speak about it in terms of binding legal force because that is conceptually like a can of worms, basically. So they had authority, sometimes great authority, but the main problem here, I think, which is also something I find really interesting, is let's say knowledge of law in the sense of communication. So it's great that this is this rescript has been issued, but if you have this problem with your neighbor and you don't know about this, because for example you're nowhere in your area is there let's say a code of Justinian available or one of its forerunners, it's not going to be much use for you, right? You need to have access to the information. It needs to circulate. You can't simply go to Constantinople. I mean, that costs a lot of money. Or wait until the emperor is in your neighborhood because that's a way to petition him. But maybe he won't come for another 10 years, This is all very complicated. So how do you get to know that this stuff exists? How does this information circulate and how can you make use of it? And how can you also, and this is sort of a related question, how can you be sure that it's correct? Because, of course, people can circulate falsified laws and there's not necessarily a way to check that. And that's also something I find very interesting. Sure. It's a very difficult topic to work on.
So there are actually laws, people are trying to follow laws in the Roman Empire that aren't actually official laws. They're just ones that people have made up locally.
Or they're doctored. I mean, this is a big hang-up in the preface to the Theodosian Code. One of the reasons to issue this authoritative copy is that there were lots of illegal copies. I'm trying to think of the exact word they use. Unauthorized is probably a better word for it. Copies that were circulating, and they were not. I mean, they were problematic. You couldn't really use them in court because there was no guarantee that they hadn't been basically messed with.
Yeah.
So this problem of authentication is something they're very aware of. The problem of circulation is also something they're aware of, and this is one of the differences I think also between, let's say, the Tetrarchs and their rescripts and sort of the 4th century laws that then go into the Theodosian Code, is that they do more. They take probably. I mean, I can't prove this, but I would think they take greater effort to make sure that the praetorian prefects and governors have copies in their archives, and there are ways to check this stuff. Yeah, so that's something I would have to say.
Yeah, it's interesting as well. One quick thing actually, for anybody that doesn't know, because I didn't know for a long time really exactly what the term meant. What is a rescript?
Let's say a bureaucratic answer to a petition. So when you have a problem, traditionally in Roman law, so when you go to the Republic, the way, if you have a conflict with your neighbor, you go to the praetor, and the praetor looks at the edict, and you agree on an action, and then you have this, the praetor appoints a judge, and so you have this sort of lawsuit. But in the time of the empire, So you can actually trace this process if you pay very careful attention. You can see it happening in Suetonius, in the lives. There are these throwaways that tell you something about how the emperors are trying to get control over the law courts. So they institute the so-called extraordinary procedure, and I think it's in one of the middle lives that we hear that this was done in order, because there was such a backlog of court cases. I think it was after the civil wars of 68-69. There was such a backlog of cases that extra courts were needed, but these courts were sort of an extension of the emperor's prerogative to judge. If you wanted to walk that route to sort of a court session, you would petition either the emperor directly, which is, complicated, or the provincial governor. You would do some kind of bureaucrat of the emperor. And so you would submit the petition, like, this is my problem, to the bureaucrat, and then the bureaucrat or the emperor would issue a response, like, this is how you solve the case. If usually the formulation would be like, if the facts are such as you say, then this is the solution. And then it was up to the judge. You would go to the judge, and the judge would say, yes, the facts are such, so this would be the solution.
Okay,
that's a rescript.
Cool. The other thing I had to ask about, though, is you mentioned earlier the great story about the slave that leaves one town, goes to another town, and becomes a town councillor.
Yeah.
How does that happen? I mean, you have a slave, he just runs away. But this was a law that had to be issued in reaction to a specific case where that actually did occur?
I believe it's a rescript, so some case came up. I would have to check this, but if I remember correctly, the person was recognized, like someone from the neighboring town or from a different part of the province, right? Yeah. Came to this town and realized, wait a minute, I know this guy. And then, of course, the slave owner had this runaway slave, so he had some kind of claim to this guy.
Who was working as a town councillor. Wow.
And so the others.
I just like the idea of like somebody going to the forum in like a neighbouring town, and then just seeing this guy walking through the forum, and everyone's like petitioning him or whatever, trying to talk to him, and he's like, I know that guy from somewhere, but where? And then the penny drops, and it's just that's. Yeah. I mean, those sort of things, as you say, the idea that the Roman world is very, I suppose you could say, ordered and structured, but there's clearly stuff that just goes on that just completely flies in the face of all of that. There are ludicrous things that occur.
Yes, the Roman world is ordered, and we get this impression from our sources, right? And especially because we have these legal sources, it all looks very well arranged and stuff. But we should never forget that. There were no smartphones. There wasn't even telephone. There wasn't even telegraph. There was nothing of the sort. Getting a letter sent was quite sort of an ordeal. So of course this was not. Just information didn't flow all that far and easily. It did, of course, but it's not like you can't compare it to the modern world, not even to half a century ago. I mean, I think you and I both remember the time before the internet.
Simpler times.
Simpler times, you had to make phone calls and stuff, but or you had to actually, 2 weeks in advance say, we meet at that town square at 2 p.m. And it worked perfectly fine, we survived until now. But you have to just sort of scale that back even further when you go back to the Roman world, and things there are lots of islands. Let's put it like that.
Because the other thing, though, on the flip side of that, is that I don't think people have necessarily an appreciation for the colossal scale of the bureaucratic machine that the Roman Empire was. Because I suppose when most people, and this is thinking more of people on the street, when you talked about the Roman world, people think of temples and the Colosseum and these big structures and aqueducts and, particularly in Britain, obviously we have things like the Vindolanda tablets, we have the Walbrook tablets, but there is only a very, 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 very tiny percentage of the basically the writings of this bureaucratic machine that survived, particularly in the western half of the empire. But it was a colossal. The archiving must have been absolutely colossal.
Yes, and it's also one of the big mysteries because we don't have archives surviving, and there are lots of debates about how this worked and when the Theodosian Code was made or when its predecessors were made. Right? Sorry, not the Theodosian, the Code of Justinian. The Theodosian Code too, same problem in a way. Like, where did they get these laws? Like, did they just go to Constantinople in the archive or in the West? Or did they go around the provincial towns? And, when an emperor was on the move and he went to different provinces and people petitioned him, like, did they have an archive with them? Like, how does this even work? We have no idea. There are some big names in the field who have very specific ideas about that. But those ideas tend to be very different, like depending on who you ask, basically.
Yeah.
And they can be quite militant about defending their views, but we simply don't know. There are some indications here and there. There's an interesting case that will interest you, Victor of Vita. He goes on about a law that was issued by one of the Vandal kings, and it seems, I think the law is sort of framed as a reaction, as undoing one of the laws that we find in the Theodosian Code, and there is a lot of reference to other laws, but we can't put our finger on it, whether he was actually reading the Theodosian Code. From the structure of the information, it doesn't seem that he's following the structure of the Theodosian Code. And so some people have suggested, no, he just had the archive at Carthage, and that's what they found in that archive. But who knows, right? It's maybe there were lost collections. It must be, because that's the other option, obviously. There may have been less famous collections about which we don't know anything. That formed sources of the Theodosian Code or the Code of Justinian. We simply have no idea. But archiving is, it's one of the big mysteries.
Yeah. Because it's interesting as well, because that's where your particular area of study or your particular area of focus with late antique texts. Because one of the things you focus on in particular, or looked at particularly on, if I'm right, is the continuation and the use of laws from the Roman period into the successor kingdoms.
Well, that's something I find interesting, and I've done work on the Visigothic side of things, and I'd be interested in looking more at the Vandal stuff as well. But that's kind of a quite tricky because we don't have sort of very abundantly obvious sort of sources. Yeah. But that's why it's interesting, right? Yeah. But actually, my PhD was on the early empire. It was on jurists, so I haven't looked at emperors basically for my thesis, and it wasn't until I got to Italy that I was more sort of forced to look at the late antique stuff as well. So, and that's something I've been busy with. But I've looked mostly at jurists rather than imperial law. So that's another. I mean, it's something that interests me, but I'm more of a jurists guy in the end.
Because you're currently juggling several publications on the way, right? You've got the monograph, you've got a couple of articles. Are they all kind of interlinked in the same subject wise, or are they? Yeah. Because the monograph is coming out of the PhD work.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I'm juggling a bunch of things. Indeed, too many things, of course. So yeah, I'm trying to finish the monograph out of the thesis, which I needed to get some distance from, and I needed to learn more about certain aspects of Roman law that I had kind of conveniently ignored for the thesis because it was simply impossible to do everything, right? And I also, I'm someone who, when you have to rewrite something, I need to have a little bit of distance, because otherwise, if you're too soon going to rewrite the entire thing, I can still feel the pain of like getting to the version that I have like in front of me, and it's like I invested so much energy and so much there was so much frustration in the writing process. Yeah. I need to sort of disown it in a sort of emotional way, right?
Yeah. I kind of wish I'd had the chance to do that. I mean, obviously the problem now is with things like the ref. You just have to get stuff out so quickly.
Yeah.
But as you're saying, I think I would have been quite well served by. I still think the book's good. Still think.
Of course.
But I think there's stuff now that I look back on, and it's only in the last year or so, some of the other stuff I've been doing to do with temples, that my brain has kind of realigned slightly in terms of my thoughts on. Yeah. It doesn't change what I said in the book, but there's basically what I've realised now is there's certain things that make my argument even more concrete that I wish I had known at the time, but I guess that can be in volume 2.
Yeah, exactly. It's a second edition.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
Director's cut. Yeah. It's so I'm now back to that, and then I mean, there were other reasons why I couldn't really work on it full time, because I first had a very intense teaching job after the PhD, and then I went off to Italy for a postdoc, but this was with an ERC project, and I needed to get up to speed with jurists in late antiquity and imperial law a little bit, and that is a big project. So it's ERC funded, and it's about the circulation of juristic texts. So the jurists are sort of the legal scholars of let's say, the late Republic and the early Empire. And
rediscovering the hidden structure, right?
Yeah, that's the name of it. Yes. And so this is what my PhD is about. It's kind of an intellectual history of this, and I approach the jurist as a form of scholarship, which I think is productive. But this is a time when emperors are still not entirely in control of the legal scene, and these are sort of people who give advice to individuals and to politicians, or officials is a better word, who are not necessarily the emperor. They are praetors or whatever. And there is an interesting power struggle going on in the 1st century and the 2nd century as well, about who ultimately controls legal authority. And this, in the end, of course, these are the emperors. But this is not. It's not the case that Augustus comes around and this has all been sorted from 27 BC or whenever you want to stick a number on it, right? This is not how it works. In late antiquity, the situation is different. But these guys, these jurists, wrote so many texts, and they were so important in articulating Roman law and much of the stuff that was basically unwritten law, customary law. That they were consulted, but we don't really have many sources after the Severian Age until Justinian collects them for us. And so it is this old dogma that there was this period of decline and jurists were absent and stuff. But this turns out to be completely not true, because there are many papyri, actually, fragments of pre-Justinianic versions. Let's say Justinian made this anthology and he edited some of the stuff, but we have, these texts have been known for a century or so. We have these papyri that predate Justinian and that have these texts, so they were read also in Egypt, and sometimes they have Greek annotation, so people were actually trying to make sense of them. And then there's also a whole bunch of pre-Justinianic collections that are simply not studied very much. And that's the part of the project I've been working on mostly, make a sort of companion introduction to these collections as texts and as a form of like an intellectual culture that engages with jurists. But we also discuss issues of transmission and circulation and sources. And so it's kind of hardcore philology meets hardcore source criticism meets intellectual history. And it's going to be a monstrous thing. It's going to be like 700 pages or 800 pages. It's an enormous amount of work. And it's extremely nice. I mean, we're working with a lot of international scholars who all bring different perspectives to the table. And it's really, like, it's working out really well. And it's really interdisciplinary scholarship at its best. Even though at first sight it may sound very tedious, dry, because it's law. And very dry and tedious because it's philology and source criticism, but I think it's important, and I think it's also productive. So you can study the philology, the transmission of these texts, and textual variations, and in many cases you can actually say something about these texts from a social historical perspective or intellectual history perspective. And I think that's very nice. It's very nice, and it changes our. I think it gives evidence that we need to really rethink the role of these jurists and legal culture in late antiquity before Justinian. Justinian did not come out of nothing.
I mean, this is going to be a very basic question, but what kind of class of person would a jurist in the Roman world be? Like, what would be their background? I mean, where did these people originate from? What kind of social milieu were they? I mean, could you just be somebody that I guess it's a position that requires a significant amount of learning. So does they have to be of elite stature? I mean, are there any? I'm showing my limits of my knowledge here, but are there any really famous jurists? I mean, obviously in the early law courts, when you think about people like Cicero, etc., obviously are in the law courts. Yeah. But later on, are there any people that stand out?
So Cicero is traditionally not considered a jurist, but a forensic lawyer, right? And so Cicero had his pals, Quintus Mucius Scaevola, and who have you. Like, there's a bunch of these people he mentions in his letters, and many of those have senatorial backgrounds. Some of them, like Quintus Mucius, was also the Pontifex Maximus, so he also had this sort of leg into pontifical legal traditions. But once you get to the empire, the first century, I mean, one of the ways the first century is often characterized as this kind of triumph of the equestrian class and the freedmen and blah blah blah, right? But this is also the case, I think, with the lawyers. You see a shift that many of them from the first century on have a kind of equestrian background or not necessarily a senatorial background. And some of them become full-time practitioners. So they start teaching or they write books half of the year. These are very highly educated people. And these are the people we know about because Pliny writes about them, or the Digest preserves their fragments. Famous ones are, of course, Ulpian and Papinian and Paul in the Severan age. Ulpian is, of course, very famous. So these people are extremely educated and productive, and their works survive. And they had very, very good, logically trained brains. But then, where it gets really interesting, so these are kind of the high class. Some people would call them literary jurists, but then there are people called juris consultus or juris prudens who pop up only in the epigraphic sources. So there are people from Nîmes, and there are people from Spain, there are people from North Africa, there are people possibly from the Rhine area, and those were people, we don't know exactly what they did because they're usually fragmentary inscriptions or grave inscriptions and stuff like that. But these people, they were probably advising, or they were sitting around the law courts, or they were pleading in the law courts, and they had some expertise. Those I find actually the more interesting ones. I like conceptual research, so I really like these highbrow guys. And that's what my book is about, because I look at the sources that come from Justinian mostly, but I've become very interested in these sort of lower class, if that's not a good term for it, so these kind of less fancy jurists, let's call them that, but they were actually doing a lot of the work and also probably the dirty work for people with money, basically.
Lawyers in Roman society have a different reputation to lawyers today.
You'll find all sorts of really awful things that are being said about lawyers in Rome, especially in late antiquity. But I don't know. I think there are people. I mean, there are polemics. It's very interesting. Cicero is very polemical against the jurists when he needs to be. So they are pedantic. They're idiots. They don't know anything except how to decline the word filius or filia in the dative plural as filiabus, this weird plural, right? This is a concoction of the lawyers because they want to exclude women from inheritances. But Cicero knows a lot about law as well, and sometimes he can be very nice about them. He can be very nice about them. So you'll find anything, basically, the entire spectrum.
So take me back then to the beginning, as in what drew you to the classical world? Was it something that you were interested in quite young, or was it, as you say, you went to university and you did contemplate going down the law route, ironically? But yeah, so how did you come to the classical world?
So I came from a family of teachers, and none of them went to university, I think. But that, I mean, it was a very interesting environment because my grandfather was a teacher of French and of Dutch. And he was a headmaster, and he founded a local historical society, and he gave me like photo books about ancient Rome and Greece when I was very little. He said one day you have to learn Gothic and stuff like that. So it was really funny. It was really funny.
Whereabouts did you actually grow up? What was your hometown?
So my hometown is called Emmen, which is a small town or a provincial town. In the province of Drenthe in the Netherlands. Drenthe is a place that has no traditional cities. It has lots of forests and just farmland, but they do have 40 odd megalithic structures. So to archaeologists, this may be known. It's an interesting place. So that's where I grew up. My grandfather was very sort of. He stimulated me to develop an interest in history, and I found it very interesting. But I was also, maybe more than history, interested in languages. So my grandfather was obviously a polyglot. My mother is a retired now music teacher and school teacher, and we went off to holidays in France, and they spoke 3-4 languages. And that was great. I went to middle school at some point. And I needed to choose a school, and the schools they're all state funded, and I mean back then at least there were no private schools, and it was unaffordable anyway. But the schools offered there were 3 main schools, and 2 of them offered Latin and Greek, and I was at the open day, and I was like, oh man, I have to do this. Like I have to do Latin, right? I have to do all the languages like French and German and English, but I also absolutely have to do Latin and Greek, and I thought Greek will be the big deal because it has a different alphabet, and it's like the Greeks, and and then the first year we didn't have the ancient languages. The second year we started with Latin, so one at a time, and I was like, this is so amazing, this is like incredible. So never mind the Greek, right? So anyway, I took the Greek. It all went just fine, but then I went to university, and so. The thing I was really interested in was sort of this conceptual, like I'm interested in concept and in problems. I can't really be bothered about chronology or even about facts, like proving that someone existed or not, or that there was one Philostratus instead of 2 or 3, right? And so in our history classes, we had good teachers, but it was a little bit like that. And so I was completely checked out. I dropped it. I didn't do what in this country would be A levels. I didn't do history. I just went on for Greek and Latin and all the languages I could possibly do. And I was like, yeah, language is nice because you have grammar and you have to decode it. It's like it's good. And then I also started to develop a liking for math. I'd always liked physics, but I'm not really sort of a science person. Like I find it very interesting, but I don't have the brain for it. So then it was time to go to university, and I thought, well, law's about solving problems, and it also gets you a job, so that might be an option. But then it was like I talked to a very nice guy at the orchestra I was playing, and he said to me, he had been studying, and he said, "You're an idiot if you don't do Greek and Latin, because if it doesn't work out professionally, you can always do another law degree, but it won't work the other way. Once you go down the law route, you will never do it again. However much you tell yourself, one day I'm going to take the degree in Greek and Latin as well. So do it." And I was like, okay, that's it. So I went off to Leiden. It was I had to get used to sort of doing philology all day, but it was I loved it. It was fantastic. I just skated around the courses in ancient history, so I still had this kind of hang up about facts and chronologies, and so then I majored in Greek and in Greek, not Latin, mind you, on a philosophical topic. It was an absolutely abysmal MA thesis. I went off to do a PhD, or I wanted to do a PhD, and I wanted to do something philosophical, but I was very disheartened by just the amount of stuff that had been written about Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics. It was like, yeah, I'd love to work on it, but I don't want to read for 2 years and then find out that my topic has been exhausted, right? So I decided, let's try to do something original. And so somehow via a friend, I came sort of onto the Roman jurists. I was like, that is interesting. They're sort of very sort of intellectual thinkers. And then via a different person, I got sort of the suggestion, why, if you like politics and problems and, philosophy and law and classics, why don't you have a look at St. Andrews? Because in St. Andrews, there's a program with law and politics and classics, and they work on ancient encyclopedias, and there's someone who does Roman law. And I checked them out, and I applied for a place, and they took me because there was a professor, my later PhD supervisor, Jill Harris, who apparently thought I was worth investing in. So I got a place, and I went, and I absolutely loved it. It was amazing, but there was a lot of work to do because I knew absolutely nothing about Roman history. I know absolutely nothing about law, jurists, etc. I knew something about Latin and knew something about ancient philosophy at a sort of undergraduate level. And it's so funny because at some point she told me, Matthijs, there are a lot of interesting thoughts going on in your head, but you need to get real about chronology and facts. This was 2 years into my PhD. It was so funny. And
she's just like, do you know who Augustus is? And
yeah,
you're like, I've heard of him. I'm aware of his work.
Kind of, yeah, exactly. Sort of like between the 3rd century BC and the 3rd century AD, somewhere there. So post-Hellenistic. It was really funny. But I think it worked out quite decently, the dissertation. I mean, the examiners were quite okay with it.
You got a job now, so
I got a job now. But
the
thing is, I came out of my PhD and I had worked on Roman law, and every historian was very nice to me. But I was still like, oh no, I'm a Latinist, right? I do Latin, the first years in the job market, I applied mostly for Latin jobs and like no responses, and then at some point, sort of the penny dropped, and I was like, no, I need to market myself as a historian, and I need to get real about facts and chronology. And that's when things started to work out better.
Yeah, that's interesting though, because that just makes me. It's actually something that Ian Haynes said when we were on the podcast. He was doing the podcast a few weeks ago. It was actually going down the line. He mentioned something that Greg Wolford once said to him, which kind of brings it back around to St. Andrews. Because was Greg there all the time you were there?
Yeah. He was on leave, but I think, and he was not always around. But I think most of the time he was. Yeah.
But Ian just said that something that Greg said to him once was, or he asked Greg, "How do you define yourself?" Because Greg obviously does a ton of different things, and Greg was like, apparently, anyway, this is how Ian put it, that Greg doesn't really think of himself necessarily as one particular thing. Like, he's not necessarily an ancient historian or an archaeologist or whatever. He's whatever the question needs him to be. Like, whatever he's doing, he's that's what he is.
Yeah.
And I thought that was quite interesting because I suppose in my case, if you were going to ask me, what are you? I'm like an archaeologist, or particularly a Roman archaeologist. But then I'm like, well, actually, I teach ancient history. I know my ancient history. I enjoy ancient history. And before we started recording as well, I've gotten very interested in recent times about things like also the history of archaeology. And I don't know, there's a number of things where I think actually, that you develop all these different interests. And I really want to go away now and write something more to do with things like reception, and let's say that kind of following on that, I really want to write something on the reception of Mithras, because it's very interesting how
it is super interesting.
He gets brought up so often in various ways. Like, I read books that I don't expect him to turn up in, and his name gets mentioned, and I'm just like, oh. But
isn't he kind of this token alternative for Christianity or something?
Yeah, right? It's just a weird one, because Thomas More in his Utopia has Mitra as the deity the islanders worship, and then towards the end of writing the book I was reading Neil Gaiman's American Gods, which is like a fiction book about deities. I don't know if you come across it at all.
I've not read it.
Yeah, it's about like deities, like where they get conjured up in people's minds, but then they become like real beings, but then people like lose interest and they're kind of down on their luck really and trying to fight against the kind of oncoming tide of like new deities, which are like the internet and things like that. But there's just a throwaway line in there about Mithras where one of the guys is talking about him. It's like, have you heard from Mithras recently? And he's like, I saw him like trying to hitch a ride down the road once. Yeah, Jesus came and nicked all his stuff. So, and then just after that, I read John Julius's Norwich book on the popes, which in the opening chapter talks about Peter and the very first popes, but it mentions the cult of Mithras as being a rival to Christianity. And I was just like, two quite different books, like fiction book and non-fiction, but for popular audience, and think about the Thomas More stuff as well. And I was just like, it's an interesting thing that the name crops up so often. And as you say, quite often it crops up in relation to when someone's talking about Christianity or Christian themes, although more ironically using it more in a positive sense, whereas the other, but yeah, no, it's just something interesting to there. But to kind of just go back around to the point, it was kind of about, in my case, being like, well, I'm an archaeologist, but I can do that stuff. Like I can write something that's not really based around archaeology.
I mean, one of the things is that in this incredibly crowded job market, we have to be very pragmatic about marketing ourselves. There are so many excellent people fishing for the one job that comes up every now and then, that you really have to be able to market yourself in different ways, and you need to just find out what they want to hear. Because you somehow need to make at least the first cut. It's despairing what the job market. But I think this is a way that forces you to be pragmatic about how you frame yourself and to be able to show, yes, I'm an archaeologist when I need to be, and I'm an ancient historian, or I'm an ancient historian who brings a lot of archaeology to the table, or I can even do Latin or something like that, right? Or epigraphy or stuff like that. That was really what my wake up moment was about. It's like, it's not about me. If I want to get a job, and I hate that I had to be so sort of. Is mercenary a good word? Like I basically feel that I had to dress myself in different clothes. I hate that it has to be like that, but I just need to do this if I want to survive in the profession, which at that point I wanted to, and I still want.
Yeah.
So.
Because you ended up going to America for 2 years to teach there?
I did, yeah. That was my first job, and that was, they always say the first job away from your PhD granting institution is the most important one. I agree. That was an amazing experience. It was good. I got to teach almost like everything, or at least sort of the entire spectrum from, archaic Greece to late antiquity. I did Latin. And you have to just go in and teach like a survey of the entire Greek world or the Roman world. You have to prepare your lectures, and they have 15-week semesters with 2 or 3 lectures a week. So you can do the math. That's a lot of hours playing with PowerPoint. It was great. It was so good. It was it is an enormously helpful thing for your own general sort of overview of the field, and it makes you very adaptable to sort of step into new teaching situations and do things. Yeah, I enjoyed that very much.
Yeah. How have you found the shifting, moving around countries, in terms of, I guess, like, we talked about this with Sophie last week and previously with Patty as well, about the kind of different ways in which this, like, the different systems that you encounter in different countries.
Yeah, it is quite different. I studied in the Dutch system, which was a very focused. It's much like it is here, but people come in with 5 years of ancient languages, so it was very philological. We did this pretty intense reading list for a couple of years. And then it was basically, you were more or less on your own. So you had to take some seminars and write papers and write a dissertation. But, I found it pretty hands-off, and I wish there had been a little bit more guidance. But I survived all right. And then, of course, I came to the UK for my graduate studies and did a little bit of teaching. Then I went to America, where the system is very much for undergraduate education. Students enroll and they either pick or do not yet pick a major, but the degrees are very wide. So you get a lot of students who in your classes who will only be taking this class in the classics department. So there is this what they call general education courses or modules. And you will get, 100 students or 50 students, and most of them will be engineering majors, or they will be in English, or they will be in supply chain management, like whatever. Yeah. So all the entire university, and many of those degrees, if you major in those sort of specialisms, they require you to take 1 or 2 humanities courses. And then they might end up with Roman history because they either have an interest in it, or they've seen a nice movie, or their housemate told them it was an interesting course, or something like that. You get all sorts of people with all sorts of backgrounds, and it's challenging and rewarding because you need to make sure to keep everyone on board. And there will also be majors of classics, so there will be people who know a lot already. So you have this very sort of diverse audience from very diverse places and backgrounds. You want to keep them all on board, and you just want to make sure that they come away, that they've learned something, and that they also liked it. And that is very challenging in order to sort of find the right balance. You have to be quite flexible and be able to sort of jump in and help people individually if you have to, even if that means helping 80 people. And on the other hand, it's extremely rewarding because you get these different perspectives, and people are usually quite happy to ask questions about, ancient technology or all sorts of things that, from perspectives that you haven't thought about. And so it is an extremely interesting and rewarding system to teach in. Now, then, of course, I went to Italy, but I didn't really teach. Then I went to back to the UK, so to this job. And here it's more, so the students come in because they have chosen to do ancient history or archaeology or classics or whatever. So they will have already quite a bit of knowledge, and they're also more of them are geeky about it. So it's quite different, but it's in a very different way. It's extremely rewarding to teach these students. It's marvelous. So both systems, they are very different, but they both are really, really nice to work in.
So then, just thinking about the future, because I know you certainly mentioned before, you got some very keen ideas about how you'd like to see the discipline evolve in the future.
I don't want to be an evangelist or anything. But
Please preach.
Preach. It's very late antique. We talked before a little bit about the field and the future of the field, and I think it's quite interesting to see that. There are also and it's different in different countries, but there are all sorts of pressures on classics departments, for example, for being elitist, or classics are no longer taught in school. So what do we do? And then the sort of the instant reaction is, well, we can't offer seriously a degree if the students don't have the languages. I think that's kind of a position that sort of misrecognizes the kind of pressures we are under and the dangers we're facing. And then there is also this kind of that ties in again with the sort of elitist perspective of our studies, and that is that we've been focusing a lot on Greece and Rome over the past centuries, and for Greece and Rome we've mostly been focusing on classical, what we call the classical periods, or the Augustan period, or the Golden Age, or something like that, which means that there are these kind of, if you would plot it, if you would make a chronological plot, and sort of map the frequency of studies about particular topics or eras or individuals, I mean, I think we can all imagine where the peaks are, but also where sort of the low points are. And I think there is a lot of work to be done, let's say not on the Augustan age, but on other periods of Rome, especially things like the 3rd century or
good old 3rd
later
century.
stuff. Good old 3rd century.
That's actually great. It's just mad. Like
Yeah.
the constant like chopping and changing of emperors, like emperors that we only know exist from like 2 coins.
Yeah,
this sort of
exactly.
thing. It's crazy. Like, it's fascinating period.
Yeah, it's absolutely interesting. And also on sort of less famous authors, or less fancy authors, because I mean, and this is not to offend anyone, but I mean, I'd be very hestant to advise a student to write a PhD dissertation on Virgil or Cicero. I mean, it can be done, and there are unexplored avenues in sort of the Virgilian scholarship, but that is a really crowded field, and there are lots of books and articles in many languages, and I wish we were more, not aggressive, but we were more assertive about doing things that haven't, like authors that haven't really been looked at all that much, and they can be found in all periods, I think. So that's one thing. The other thing is that
Just on a very quick side note to that, growing up, there was a collection of toys that came out in the UK and a TV series that accompanied them called Mighty Max. And in that, it was about this kid that had this baseball cap, and he travels like to different dimensions wearing this baseball cap. But his kind of mentor in it, like his Yoda character, was a like humanoid owl, old owl, whose name was Virgil. So having had that growing up, ever since then, every time someone talks to me about Virgil, I picture him as being this kind of old anthropomorphic owl, which is rather odd, but I can't escape that mental image of Virgil. To carry on,
that is pretty funny.
The owl's name was Virgil, so that's to this day. Every time someone talks about the Roman author Virgil, I just picture that. I'll show you a picture later of him, of this wise old owl, which I don't know is perhaps the best way of describing Virgil in reality.
Well, I mean, I have nothing against Virgil, and I think his text is incredibly rich, and it's a long text, etc., or a fairly sizable corpus. So it's not that, but I think in terms of, spending the resources, basically, I'd be more interested in encouraging people to work on other topics than sort of the very sort of standard classical topics. Now, the counter argument is, of course, that we need people who are experts because they need to teach this, and they need to teach this at graduate level, etc. Fair enough. But in terms of research, I really think there are other things to do that haven't had proper attention. So that's basically sort of a very personal idea. Now, the other thing I find important is, and this is being done, and it is difficult because we don't always have the sources, is to move away from the, let's say, the stratospheric level of Cicero. Cicero is great. He's amazing, but what about ordinary people? And I know it's very simple of me to say, and kind of silly of me to say, well, why don't you look at Cicero's clients, especially the poorest ones? But we don't have any evidence, right? There are of course also papyri that actually, in a different place and in a different time mostly, give us a very interesting perspective in daily life. And fortunately, there are many papyrologists who do excellent work on this. But I think there's a lot of stuff to be done. And then, so not focusing on just the elite perspective. And I think this is something maybe the philologists would have more problems with, because we simply we simply are stuck with these elite sources. But the historians can do a great job looking at these other perspectives, and I have to say the philologists have done a great job about gender studies and stuff like that. It's really great. The third thing I would have to say is
just a quick example. That just makes me think about last week talking to Sophie about her work, which focuses on looking at women in mid-Republican Rome outside of aristocratic women. So she's got a lot of interesting things to say on particularly actresses. That's just fascinating. Listening to like somebody who's exploring the lives of these people or these groups in society that don't really up until now haven't had much of a voice, or haven't had a voice for like, I don't know, 1.5 to 2,000 years or whatever. Yeah, sorry, Karen.
No, fine. The other thing is that, I mean, this is not necessarily an elite perspective, but I think, I mean, if you want to study the ancient world, and so I'm saying ancient world and not classics, I think it is really important to start thinking outside simply Greece and Rome. Now, okay, there are all kinds of problems, of course. As soon as you say that, Latin and Greek are taught in schools, and maybe like they will continue to be taught in schools, I hope. And they are taught in universities. But there's more than Latin and Greek in the ancient world, especially for historians, I suppose. So for one of the projects I've been working on, I've been looking at a Syriac text. Now I immediately I don't know Syriac at this point. I would like to learn it, but I just need to find the time, and that's the major challenge. These are Roman law texts, probably from the 5th century, from Antioch or so somewhere thereabouts, and they are used for private law suits, or maybe by a provincial governor or something, and they survive in Syriac, and it's an extremely important language to know, I think, if you want to look at the Near East in the time of the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. And there are more languages like that. I think if we talk about the Mid-Republic, we should know something about Punic. You know, Egyptian is important. We can't learn all those languages. But I think it is I would like to believe that we are moving towards a sort of conception of ancient studies, classics, and ancient history, and whatever the traditional subdivisions are, that is much more inclusive of other languages and perspectives. And I know it's a little bit of a straw man that I'm putting up, because people are actually doing this. But I really do think there is still a lot of progress to be made. And I'll be the first one to admit that I haven't got around to looking at Punic or Syriac in detail, or Ethiopic, you know. Ethiopic, some Italians discovered a 4th century text that was originally written it was translated from Greek, I think, but it is maybe a Latin text. I'm not sure now. But the text only survives in Ethiopic, and it was just recently discovered because nobody had bothered to learn Ethiopic, even though we kind of knew it could be important. And I know it's a huge investment of time to learn a language, and you may not find all that much stuff. But I think it's important because, you know, it's the ancient world. We want to talk about it, and we can't simply be stuck in Rome and Greece and Constantinople and wherever you want to get stuck. But I think it's important. Now I just need to to find the time to live up to my principles, right?
I think you've already got enough languages under your belt anyway. You're doing fine at the moment.
That's called ancient languages.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I still haven't done the Gothic, though.
After all these years. A cross that you carried with you your entire life. It's interesting as well, just, saying that though, because that probably does also reflect, I guess, in some respects, the very Eurocentric view of the past that scholars have traditionally had. I mean, if you go right back to episode 3 of the podcast when I had Zena Kamash on, Zena was talking about the importance nowadays of people tweeting things, for example, in languages other than English. Like if you're talking about the archaeology perhaps of the Near East, like Syria or somewhere like that, or Iraq or whatever, you know, publishing it, putting it online in Arabic, or you know, just doing that. It's one of those things that you don't really see that much, but it's because most people like disseminate this information primarily through kind of a very Eurocentric way of doing it. And it's just very interesting that reflects kind of what you're saying about people's approaches to the past more generally, where people still focus on, you might say, the kind of the root of the European languages in terms of Greek and Latin. And
Greek and Latin have traditionally played such an important role in education in the West. I mean, ever since antiquity, but not least also in the last 2 or 3 centuries, with the rise of this sort of classical scholarship, if that's a good term. And you know, there are also limits to what you can do. You only have so much time, you only have so much brain capacity, and you only have so much patience, because learning a language is really annoying. I mean, it takes a lot of time, a lot of willpower, and a lot of frustration. It's not just like a walk in the park, basically. It really is an investment. But I think I wouldn't mind sort of better integration between traditional Greek and Latin departments or classics departments and these Near Eastern departments that are in existence in certain universities, but not all of them. And I think that would be a good thing. But then, of course, there are disciplinary boundaries and different ways of thinking about how to study things. So it is all very complicated. It's very easily said, but not so easily done. I realize that. And then there needs to be money for that, to have people who actually, to employ people who actually know Syriac and have specialism as well. Yeah, that's complicated. But we'll have to see how things evolve.
You don't fancy trying your hand at cuneiform at some point as well?
Well, yes, it would be interesting, but at this point I need to be somewhat realistic about how much I can do. And because we also have to be productive, right?
Maybe a project for retirement.
Project for retirement. I mean, I would do something that has to do like a language that was in use in the Roman Empire and late antiquity. So maybe cuneiform is a bit before my time.
Fair enough. Yeah. Just to round off then, so as you mentioned, you've got a few publications on the way. You've got stuff in proof at the moment.
Yeah, it's a nightmare.
Yeah. When can we expect to see the stuff appear though? Things like that. Have you got an idea at the moment?
Well, so the idea is 2020 for the book and the volume. We'll have to see because the book depends on me, and I'm making very good progress. But the volume is not simply dependent on me. Like, I work with a lot of people, and I'm dependent on them delivering their stuff, and then we have to have some of that stuff translated into English.
This is the rediscovering the hidden structure.
Yeah. These pre-Justinianic collections. So yeah, we need to get it out in 2020, basically. But we are dependent on other people, and that's only natural that it may take a little while. I mean, we've all missed deadlines, and we're proud of it, I suppose. Don't tell the students, but this is how these things go. So soon, I hope. Yeah, there is work to be done though, and that's the thing. So I don't want to get anyone's super excited, right? No, probably not for this Christmas.
Leave it for next year's Christmas list. And so, if
hopefully for next year's Oscars.
And if people want to contact you, they can just find you via the Kent webpage.
Absolutely,
they want to discuss Roman law in particular.
Yeah, they can if they want to. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's to say I'm a convert in terms of the interest that I think of the subject. I think as you say, a window into people's everyday lives. Yeah, it's nice. That's nice.
Yeah, it's nice. It's the especially the rescripts and the papyri, because the papyri often contain petitions. So you have both sides. You can't basically ever match them, but you get a good impression of both sides. Yeah. So. Get on to pepperology, David.
Yeah. maybe for my retirement. Okay, right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.